take the rifle out of her hands. That's an order, and I want it noted in the log. Lieutenant Calder said it, the way another man might report a burned-out bulb in a hallway, no heat in it at all, only the flat certainty of someone who has already decided a thing is a nuisance and is simply waiting for the room to agree. He stood at the front of the briefing tent, with a clipboard held a little higher than it needed to be, and he looked down the roster, and then he looked at the one name that didn't sit right with him, and he said the next part to the senior NCO, without ever once looking at the soldier in question. Whose idea was the woman? 4 words. Nobody answered. A folding chair creaked somewhere in the back. Outside, a generator coughed and caught. Staff Sergeant Wren Maddox sat in the second row, with her hands folded loosely in her lap, and her face arranged into the particular neutral she had spent 11 years learning to build, and she did not give him anything to work with, because she had learned a long time ago that the cheapest thing she owned was a reaction, and she had stopped handing it out for free. 19 days later, in the thin blue cold before sunrise, that same soldier put a single round through 2,114 meters of mountain air and walked an entire patrol back through the wire with not one empty chair behind them. But that part came later, and the thing about Maddox, the thing the narrator of any honest account of her would have to sit with for a while before understanding, was that she never once treated the shot as the center of the story. To her, it was arithmetic that had finished resolving itself. The center for her was always the long, quiet work nobody bothered to watch. She had grown up in the high country outside Coeur d'Alene, where the wind off the lake came up the draws in the afternoon, with a schedule you could almost set a watch to, and her father had taught her to read it before he ever let her touch a trigger. Cyrus Maddox was a cabinet maker by trade and a patient man by temperament, and the first lesson he gave her, when she was 9 and barely able to hold the .22 steady, had nothing to do with the target at all. Wind first, he said. Always wind first. The target isn't going anywhere. The air is the only thing in this whole picture that's alive. She had not understood it then. She understood it completely by the time she was 12, and by then she could call a flag at 300 meters and tell him what it meant before he asked, and he would say nothing, only nod once, the small economical nod of a man who showed pride by refusing to spend it cheaply. Her mother was a different kind of teacher. Lorraine Maddox had done 22 years in Army intelligence and come out of it with a habit of correctness that some people found exhausting and her daughter found like oxygen. From her mother, Wren learned that information is a thing you owe people, that an analyst who softens a hard read to make a room comfortable is not being kind, only cowardly, and that being right and being believed were 2 entirely separate accomplishments that arrived, when they arrived at all, on separate schedules. You can be right and alone. Her mother told her once in the kitchen, not unkindly, get used to the gap. Most people never close it. The ones who do close it by being right so many times in a row that the math becomes embarrassing to ignore. So Maddox had spent her career being right and quietly and mostly alone. And she had made a kind of peace with the gap. The unit she joined that autumn was a light infantry company pushed out to a fire base in the eastern mountains. A cluster of Hesco walls and plywood and antennas perched where 2 valleys met, and the men in it were, by and large, decent and tired and unremarkable in the way most soldiers are unremarkable, which is to say competent and afraid and trying. The problem was not the company. The problem was Calder. He was 24 and freshly minted out of the officer pipeline, and he carried his commission the way some men carry a new truck, with a watchfulness for any scratch. He had read about leadership. He had not yet been led anywhere he didn't choose to go, and he had certainly never had to revise himself in front of people who outranked him in everything but paper. It was not, the narrator would be careful to say, that Calder hated her. Hatred would have required him to take her seriously enough to have a feeling about. What he had instead was a category problem. He had been issued a picture of the world in which the designated marksman attached to his platoon was a particular kind of person, and Maddox was not that person. And rather than update the picture, he simply treated the discrepancy as an administrative error somebody above him had failed to correct. He called her the marksman. He called her the asset. He called her, in one early radio transmission she chose never to mention to anyone, the optic, as though she were a piece of glass that had wandered onto his net. He almost never called her by her name, and after the first week she stopped expecting it and started, very deliberately, saying her own name aloud at every briefing. In every report, on every transmission, The way you keep a fire lit in a place you suspect would prefer the dark. Sergeant First Class Okonkwo noticed. Okonkwo noticed most things and announced almost none of them. He was a big, slow-moving man from Houston by way of Lagos, a platoon sergeant with 16 years in, and the rare gift of saying exactly enough and then stopping. He had watched Maddox clean her rifle her first night at the fire base, watched the order in which she did it, watched her check the same seals twice, not from anxiety, but from a discipline that had clearly been bored into her young, and he had decided about her before she ever fired a shot. He didn't tell her this. What he told her the third day, sliding a cup of bad coffee across the plywood without offering to share his own, was simpler. He doesn't know where to file you, Okonkwo said, tipping his chin toward the operations shack where Calder was. So he's going to pretend you go in the drawer he already has. She had looked at the coffee and not the man. That's not my problem to solve, she said. No, Okonkwo agreed. It's his. He just doesn't know it's a problem yet. The young ones gravitated to her the way young soldiers gravitate toward anyone who seems to know precisely what they are doing. As if competence were a kind of warmth they could stand near. The one who stuck was Private First Class Vela, 19 and from somewhere outside Fresno, a relentless asker of questions, the sort of kid whose curiosity had clearly gotten him in trouble his whole life, and would, Maddox suspected, eventually save it. He found her one afternoon staring at a far ridgeline through her glass, and asked what she was looking at. And when she told him there was nothing there, he asked why she was looking, and when she said because there might be something there tomorrow. He went quiet in a way that suggested she had handed him something heavier than he'd expected to be carrying. You do that all the time, Vela said eventually. The looking? Yes, she said. Even when there's nothing. Especially then. That's kind of awful, he said, and she almost smiled, because it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. It's just the job, she said. The awful part isn't the looking. The awful part is when you look and you see it coming, and you say so, and the room decides it doesn't want to be true. Vela thought about that for a while. Does that happen a lot, he asked. She didn't answer that one. She just went back to the ridge. The thing she saw coming arrived first as a pattern in the intelligence summaries, and then as a pattern in the dirt. For most of 2 weeks, the higher reporting had described elevated movement in the Southern Valley, the kind of vague phrasing that meant the analysts had noticed something stirring and didn't yet have the shape of it. Maddox read the summaries the way her mother had taught her. Not for what they said, but for what they were carefully not saying. And on her own time, in a notebook nobody asked to see, she cross-referenced the movement against the terrain she had been cataloging since she arrived. The intervals were narrowing. The displacement was incremental and directional, always toward the same dead ground at the base of the northern spur. And the geometry of it lined up with exactly one thing. Somebody was walking a crew-served weapon into a firing position, a piece at a time, slow enough that no single movement tripped an alarm, and they were doing it within range of the very ridge the platoon was scheduled to occupy. She raised her hand in the briefing the second week of October. Calder gave her the half-second pause that was his particular tell, the pause that was not about thinking, but about deciding how much weight to grant something he had already discounted. Staff Sergeant Maddox, she said, putting her own name into the air, the way she always did, because Calder would not. The movement signatures in the South approach aren't general. The pattern's consistent with the staged emplacement of an indirect fire asset, most likely a mortar, into prepared ground at the foot of the northern spur. If we put the platoon on that ridge on schedule, we'll be sitting inside its arc before it's even finished setting up. The intelligence calls it elevated activity, Calder said. With respect, sir, the intelligence is describing the symptom. I'm describing the cause. The intervals are too regular and too directional for foraging or transit. This is positioning. I'd recommend we identify the likely firing point and build a contingency around it before we commit to the ridge. He looked at her the way a man looks at a clock he suspects is fast. We'll follow standard patrol protocols, he said. Marksman, confirm your equipment status. There it was, the demotion of her into a piece of gear, and Okonkwo in the front row shifted half a centimeter in his seat, which from Okonkwo was the equivalent of a man standing up and turning over a table. Equipment is confirmed, sir, Maddox said, and she did not push, because she had learned that pushing a closed door only teaches the door it was right to be closed. She had put the read on the table. What the room did with it was not, in that moment, hers to control. But there was one thing that was always hers, And that night she made a decision about it without telling anyone, which was that she would be ready, and that when the moment came, as in her experience it always came, it would not find her unprepared simply because the person in charge had decided in advance not to believe her. The rifle was a bolt gun chambered in .338, a long, heavy precision instrument that lived in her hands the way a good tool lives in the hands of someone who has stopped thinking of it as separate from her arms. Past about 1,200 meters, the manuals got vague and the doctrine got nervous. And past about 1,800, the official literature mostly threw up its hands because the published numbers were written for averages, and Maddox had never once in her life been an average. She knew what the cartridge could do in the hands of someone who actually solved for the conditions instead of guessing at them. The trouble was that nobody around her knew it, and a capability nobody believes you have is, functionally, a capability you do not have, right up until the instant it isn't. So in the failing light of the next several evenings, she went out to the improvised range on the East Berm, and she worked at distances that made no sense to anybody watching. Vela found her there one evening, squinting at a steel plate so far out, he had to ask twice whether she was serious. "Is that past your range?" he asked. "The book's range," she said, settling behind the gun. "Not mine, but you're shooting it anyway." "Yes, why?" "Because in a few days we're going back to that ridge, and whatever's in that valley is going to be further than the book says I can reach. And I would rather be ready for a shot I never have to take than need one I never practiced." She fired. The plate rang a full breath after the report, the sound arriving from a distance that didn't seem to belong to a rifle. And Vela sat down on the dirt behind the barrier and watched her work for the better part of an hour without saying another word. Later, he told Okonkwo what he had seen, and Okonkwo was quiet for a long moment, and then said only, "Good, somebody's paying attention." And when Vela asked whether they ought to do something, Okonkwo said the only thing they could do was make sure they were behind her when it counted. The patrol stepped off in the dark, 12 of them, and the walk to the ridge took the better part of 2 hours over ground that argued with every step. Maddox spent it the way she spent all movement, reading the air, checking intervals, keeping the constant running ledger in the back of her mind the way a pilot keeps fuel and altitude without ever quite looking at either. The wind that morning was lighter than the historical pattern she'd tracked, a thin, westerly drift, and the temperature differential between the valley floor and the high ground was less than typical for the season, and all of it folded into the calculation without her breaking stride. Vela fell in beside her partway up, not to talk, she'd noticed, but because something in him steadied when he walked near someone who seemed to know exactly where they were going. After a while he said low, "You really think it's down there?" "I think the math says it's down there," she said. "Whether we find it today is a separate question." "Does it scare you?" he asked, knowing. "The not knowing is what scares people," she said. "The knowing is just information, and you can work with information." He chewed on that. "And if you know and nobody listens?" he asked. And she didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was the one she'd been living for 2 weeks, and she wasn't certain a 19-year-old needed it at that hour in that dark. "Then you make sure you're ready anyway," she said finally, "and you hope ready is enough." They reached the ridge as the sky behind the eastern peaks went from black to a bruised gray, and Maddox put her glass on the valley floor, and the ledger in the back of her mind locked closed with the quiet finality of a calculation reaching its only possible answer. The ground at the base of the northern spur had been disturbed in a pattern she had seen in training imagery and in her own notebook, the specific geometry of an emplacement nearly complete. She keyed the net and reported it plainly, range and bearing, the disturbed earth, the assessment that it was a mortar position in the final stage of being made ready, and she requested permission to range and assess. Calder's voice came back tight. "Maintain observation only." And then the valley made the decision for everyone. There was movement on the spur, the wrong kind, organized and fast, and Okonkwo's voice on the net said the words contact and adjusting almost in the same breath, and the platoon's careful overwatch plan came apart against the fact that the enemy had finished setting up first and now had eyes on the ridge. The first mortar round walked in short, and the second corrected, and the third would not be short, and the patrol was caught in the open on high ground with the worst kind of weapon arcing toward them, and a withdrawal route that meant crossing 200 meters of exposed slope. The crew on the valley floor was working with the unhurried competence of people who believed they had won the geometry, and in every sense that the manuals understood, they had. Maddox was already behind the gun. She had been behind it, in her mind, for 19 days. The range was 2,114 meters, and she knew it was that. Because she had ranged it the moment the disturbed ground confirmed itself, and she had already solved most of the firing problem in the back of her head during the walk up. The way she solved everything, in advance, so that when the moment arrived, she would not be doing arithmetic. She should have finished hours ago. The drift was the thin westerly she had tracked for 6 mornings. The angle compensation she had internalized. The drop at that distance was enormous. The round would spend more than 3 seconds in the air, and in those 3 seconds, the air would have its say, exactly as her father had promised her it would when she was 9 years old and could barely hold the stock. Wind first, always wind first. She did not rush. The narrator of an honest account would want to dwell on that because everything in the situation was screaming for speed, and she gave it none. Because she had learned that haste is just fear wearing a uniform, and fear had never once improved a firing solution. She breathed. She found the small, still place between heartbeats that her whole life had been training toward. She held the wind in the correct dead sight picture, aiming not at the man on the valley floor, but at the column of empty air the man would be standing in by the time the round arrived. And then, in the gap between one heartbeat and the next, she pressed. The round was gone for what felt, to everyone who would later try to describe it, like an impossibly long time. And then, 2,114 meters away, the crew chief on the mortar simply went down, and the unhurried competence on the valley floor turned in an instant into the scattering of men who have understood that something they believed to be impossible has just been done to them, and the firing stopped, and the geometry that had defeated the platoon a moment earlier broke apart, and the withdrawal that should have cost chairs cost none. 12 walked up that ridge. 12 walked back down it. Maddox stayed behind the gun a beat longer than she needed to, watching the dust settle through the glass, and then she ran the bolt, caught the spent brass in her gloved palm, and put it in her chest pocket, without quite knowing why. The way a person keeps a thing before they understand they are keeping it. There should not have been a problem after that. There was a problem after that, and the problem was a piece of paper. The after-action report that went up the chain was written by Calder, and in 11 pages describing the engagement, in the careful official language of such things, the soldier who had made the shot that broke the ambush appeared as the marksman, as the optic, as the platoon's organic precision capability, 14 separate times by Okonkwo's later count, and not once by name. Her name was in the roster annex, where names go to be filed and forgotten. It was nowhere in the body, nowhere in the narrative, nowhere in the sentence that mattered. The report described the shot the way you might describe a piece of equipment, functioning as designed. An event that had apparently happened without a human being to author it. Okonkwo read it first, because Okonkwo read everything. And he came to find Maddox in the equipment bay where she was breaking down the rifle, and he set a printout on the bench beside her and said nothing, which was how she knew it was bad. She read it. She read it again, more slowly the way her mother had taught her, for what it was working around. She found her name in the annex. She found the absence of it everywhere else. She set the pages down with the same care she gave a clean barrel and went back to reassembling the gun, and Okonkwo watched her hands not shake and understood that this was not the same as her being all right. It was a major named Sloan, attached up at battalion as an operations officer who actually moved it. Sloan had pulled the radio logs to reconcile the timeline for a separate report and had found a recorded transmission that did not match the written one, a calm female voice ranging a target at 2,114 meters. And requesting permission to engage, a transmission with a name attached. Staff Sergeant Maddox said 3 times in the soldier's own voice, because she had always made certain her name was in the air. Sloan laid the log next to the report and saw the gap between them, and Sloan, who did not know Maddox at all and had no reason to do anything but the right thing, drafted an amendment that put the name back where the event had happened. The corrected report landed on the battalion commander's desk on a Tuesday. Lieutenant Colonel Ambrose was 53 and had been in the Army 31 years, and had developed across those years the specific ability to read a document for the information it contained and the separate information it was avoiding. He read Calder's version, and then he read Sloan's amendment beside it, and then he read the radio log. And then he set all three down and sat in his chair for a while. He pressed the intercom and asked aid for the patrol and the platoon sergeant from the engagement, and the aide named Calder and Okonkwo. And Ambrose said, and the marksman, and the aide said, "Sir, the roster has that as Staff Sergeant Maddox." And Ambrose looked at the corrected page in front of him, at the name and the rank and the distance, and said, "Then get me Staff Sergeant Maddox. That's the name I should have known before today." He met with the three of them, and it lasted under an hour, and Maddox could have told you the exact number of minutes because she counted things other people left approximate. Ambrose ran it cleanly. He asked Okonkwo for the timeline, and Okonkwo gave it chronologically and without color. He asked Calder for his decisions, and Calder, to his credit, answered every question without softening or reframing a single one, like a man who had spent the night past in some private reckoning and come out the other side of it into a hard, plain honesty. And then Ambrose looked at Maddox and said, "Walk me through the shot." She did. She walked him through the days of observation, the narrowing intervals in the intelligence, the read she had put on the table, and watched the room decline, the wind she had tracked every morning at that elevation, the drop, the drift, the time of flight, the column of empty air she had aimed into because the man would be standing in it by the time the round arrived. Ambrose listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet a moment, and then he said, "The doctrine doesn't account for a shot at that range with that weapon." "No, sir," she said. "It doesn't. So there's no manual that explains what you did." "The physics explains it, sir," she said. "The manual just hasn't caught up." Ambrose looked at her for a long moment, and something settled in his face, the small, clear shift of a man who has just understood something exactly. "I'm recommending a Bronze Star with the Valor device," he said, "and the corrected report stands as the permanent record. Your name, your rank, your shot. That isn't a courtesy, Staff Sergeant. It's a correction of an error, and the error should never have been made." She said, "Thank you, sir," and meant it, and the part of her that had been holding something in a fixed and careful position for 2 weeks did not relax, exactly, but it loosened by a degree she would only recognize as relief much later. Calder came to find her in the equipment bay that same afternoon. He stood at the same careful distance he always kept, and his face was different again. Neither the architectural assessing's face nor the dismissive one, but the face of someone who has spent 18 hours being shown the gap between what he did and what he should have done and has not yet finished closing it. "The report," he said, and stopped and started again. "The way I referred to you in the original, the designation instead of the name." He stopped a third time. She set down the part she was working on and gave him her whole attention, not to make it easier for him, but because she had decided she would hear whatever he said with the same precision she brought to everything and let it be exactly what it was. "I don't have a good explanation," he said finally. "I've been trying to build one all night, and I keep arriving at the fact that I don't have one. What you did out there is something I won't see again, and I wrote it up like it happened without anyone doing it. I'm not asking you to take this as an apology that fixes the original document, because it doesn't. But I'm sorry, Staff Sergeant Maddox." She thought about all the true things she could have said, accumulated over 2 weeks of being called a function instead of a person, and 14 times of being erased from her own act. She thought about what her mother would say and what Okonkwo would say, and she said the only thing that was complete and needed nothing added to it. "Don't do it again," she said. "Not to me. Not to anyone." He nodded. "Yes, Staff Sergeant," he said. And for the first time in their whole acquaintance, the rank he handed her sounded like it belonged to her. And he left, and she picked the part back up and finished the gun. The medal came at a battalion formation. On a cold, bright Friday morning, the whole battalion drawn up in the open ground, between the operations center and the motor pool. The colors behind the commander, the collective stillness of people who know what kind of event they are standing in. Ambrose read the citation aloud, and the words that had been missing from Calder's first report were all of them present now. Her name, her rank, the distance, the mortar crew, the 12 who walked back. Maddox stood at attention and listened to her own name, read out in front of the entire battalion, and kept her eyes forward, because she knew that if she looked anywhere else, she would feel more than she was prepared to feel in front of that many people. When Ambrose pinned the medal to her uniform, he said, quietly enough that it stayed between the two of them, "The Army's better for having you in it, Staff Sergeant. I'm sorry it took us this long to put it in writing." She held his gaze and said, "Thank you, sir." And he stepped back and saluted her, and she returned it, and it was done. She called her mother that evening on the morale line, the one with the 60-minute daily limit, and she had practiced in her head how to say it small and contained. But with the phone actually in her hand, the practiced version felt wrong. Too managed, too much like a briefing, and not enough like a daughter. So she said it plain. I made a shot, she said. There was a mortar crew in the valley below us. I took out the man running it. Nobody on our patrol got hurt. A silence, not the worried kind, a different kind. How far, her mother asked, because Wren Maddox had spent 22 years measuring exactly this kind of thing. 2,114 meters, Wren said. Another silence, longer. That's past 1.25 miles, her mother said. Yes, you're telling me now, because something happened with the recognition. Bronze Star with Valor, Wren said. They read it at formation today, and when her mother spoke again, her voice had changed. Not broken, Wren Maddox did not break on a morale line because she knew her daughter needed her steady, but it had moved past whatever it was holding and arrived somewhere underneath it. I have always been proud of you, her mother said, but what I'm feeling right now is not going to fit inside a phone call, and Wren felt something shift in her own chest, something she had held in a careful fixed position for 19 days because there had been no time and no space and no person she had let herself open it with, and she said, I know. Me too. Tell Dad, her mother said, and Wren said, I'll tell him when I'm home. And her mother said, you will not. I am telling that man tonight, he has been carrying you on his back since the day you shipped out, and he has earned the news. And then, unexpectedly, Wren laughed, a real one, small and sudden, and her mother laughed too. And for a moment across an ocean, on a line with a 60-minute limit, they were just two people who loved each other, laughing about Cyrus Maddox crying in a kitchen in Idaho. She came home in the deep part of winter, off a transport in the dark, and her father's truck was in the lot, and her parents were standing where they were not supposed to be able to stand, which meant her father had talked someone past a barrier, which was exactly the kind of thing her father did, and her mother pretended to disapprove of while letting it happen. Her mother hugged her first, long and complete and unhurried. Her father waited, and when her mother stepped back, he stood in front of his daughter and looked at her the way. He looked at things he was relieved to find in one piece, taking a slow inventory, and then he put his arms around her and held on, and she felt him exhale. A long, unsteady breath that carried something he had been holding for the length of a deployment, and he didn't apologize for his wet eyes when he stepped back, because Cyrus Maddox did not apologize for things that were simply true. There's something at the house, he said. It was on the kitchen table when they got there, a shadow box he had built himself. The joints fitted so cleanly the whole thing would outlast everyone in the room. Inside were 3 things. The metal photograph from the image she'd sent and printed properly because the real one was still in transit with her gear. The spent brass from the shot which she had carried, wrapped in a square of cloth in the bottom of her bag, without ever quite explaining to herself why. And a photocopy of the corrected report, the amended one, with her name highlighted in yellow. Everywhere it appeared. Every Staff Sergeant Maddox, every Sergeant Maddox, marked in bright, clean strokes. She stood and looked at it for a long time. The yellow, she said. So you can see every place it is, her father said. Every place it belongs. She looked at the highlighted name, again and again, in all the places where Calder's first version had left nothing, the places the correction had put her back. It's right, Dad, she said, and he said, I know, and she put her arm around him and he put his around her. And they stood at the table while her mother made coffee behind them and pretended not to be watching. Years went by. She finished her service and left the way she had done everything, without ceremony, and took analytical work near a post in civilian life, the kind that used the part of her brain that had always run the numbers quietly underneath everything else. She called her parents on Sundays. Her mother taught a course on intelligence analysis now and had opinions about every corner of the world, delivered with the certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime being right and knows it. Her father built 3 more shadow boxes over the years, one for each deployment she finished, and they hung in a row down the hallway that her mother called excessive and her father called accurate. Okonkwo retired and sent her an email that read in its entirety, 30 years done, going fishing. You did good, Maddox, and she printed it and put it in a drawer. Vela made sergeant and sent her a photo of his new rank, and she wrote back, about time, now stop asking so many questions, and he sent a laughing face. And she looked at the photo longer than she would have admitted to anyone. She never heard from Calder again, though Okonkwo mentioned once, years on and with no comment attached, that the man had made lieutenant colonel and that his evaluations consistently praised his care in attributing credit accurately in official records, which was in its silence, its own kind of comment, and which she received the same way. One evening she was at her own kitchen table when her phone rang with a number she didn't know, and she almost let it go, and didn't. The voice on the other end was young and female and deliberate, the deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed and is trying not to let it show. "Is this Staff Sergeant Maddox, the one from the report?" "Who's asking?" Maddox said. "My name's Bello," the voice said. "Private first class. I'm in a marksmanship pipeline. Somebody posted the corrected report in a forum and I read it and I tracked down Sergeant Okonkwo and he gave me your number. He said if I was serious enough to find him, I was serious enough to call you." Maddox made a mental note to say something to Okonkwo and a second mental note that she would not actually say anything to Okonkwo. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "Everything," Bello said, the word coming out with the complete unguarded directness of someone who means it. Maddox looked across the room at the shadow box on the shelf, the metal and the brass, and the report with her name in yellow. And she thought about a briefing tent and a clipboard held a little too high and 4 contemptuous words. About 19 days of work, nobody wanted to watch. About 3 seconds of air in the column of nothing she had aimed into. About 12 people walking back down a ridge. About being rounded off and erased and put back. "Okay," she said. "Start with the wind." "The wind," Bello said. "The wind first," Maddox said. "Everything else is downstream of the wind." Most people want to start with the shot, and that's exactly why most of them aren't ready when the shot is the only thing left to do. A pause on the line, and then, "Okay, tell me about the wind." And Maddox pulled a notepad toward her and began to talk. And that was the real end of it, not the medal and not the corrected report and not the box on the shelf, but a woman at a kitchen table handing the work forward because the shot that could not be made had been made, and the name that had been taken had been given back. And now there was someone on the other end of a line who needed to hear that the manual was never the limit, that the air was the limit, and that the air could be read by anyone patient enough to stop staring at the target and start listening to the only thing in the whole picture that was alive.